still 10 years away from the very first PlayStation. And 23 years away from the first iPhone. In fact, most video games at this time consisted of dots on the screen and little lines moving across the screen. And I kid you not, the best selling toy of the year was the hacky sack. The best toy that the entire human race could come up with was a small bag made out of yarn and full of beans. It was bleak. It was bleak until Transformers were game changing. They were magical. They were certainly more than meets the eye. In fact, they are so popular, this came in the mail this week.
Oh yeah,
It is Transformers. Still selling. Still awesome. Still a great toy. Transformers were totally unique compared to regular action figures because they could change or transform into something totally different than what they originally appeared to be. In a lot of ways, having a Transformer was like having two different toys because one, in a few twists and turns, they could transform into a plane or a car or a robot, a dinosaur, or even a bird. And I know, I can hardly believe it myself. They were amazing. It wasn't just Transformers either. You see, the Transformers were the good robots, but there was also evil robots. And wait for it, they were called Decepticons. I know, 80s had great toys, bad names. Serious question for you though, as we dig in tonight. Have any of you ever met someone that's kind of like a Transformer or a Decepticon? And what I'm talking about is they present themselves one way, but in reality they are something completely different. Sadly, it's probably not difficult to think of at least one person you've met who seemed really nice, only to be really mean behind your back or someone else's back. But here's a more difficult question though. Have you ever been that kind of person to someone else? I mean, I'm not proud of it. I know I have. But over the past couple weeks, we have been talking about what it means to be a part of the church and why it's such an important part of our identity as Christ followers. Tonight, I want to take a look at who we are when we're here versus who we are when we're out there. Whether or not it matches up. Who we are when we're in here and whether it matches when we go out there. For the final 3 years of Jesus' life, Jesus was a traveling teacher called a rabbi. As a rabbi, he would often travel from town to town and teach to anyone who would listen. Unfortunately, we only have a few scriptures where someone wrote down what Jesus taught during his sermons. The longest one we have is the Sermon on the Mount, which is found in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. The Sermon on the Mount is by far the most famous, in part because it's the longest, but also because of what Jesus actually said on the hillside that day. You see, whether he was speaking to one person or thousands, Jesus didn't hold back. His style was definitely to say what needed to be said. And that's exactly what he did. So tonight we're going to start digging in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13. And it says, "You are the salt of the earth. But what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless." So Jesus, he starts talking about salt. And what are some things that we use salt for?
Chips.
Chips?
French fries.
Fries?
Preserving meat.
Okay. Flavor, right?
Shove in our mouths.
Again, I'm not asking you a trick question. I was asking you what salt was used for. So today, with a few exceptions, we use salt mostly to make our food taste better. In Jesus' day, salt wasn't just used as a flavor. Since they didn't have a means of refrigeration, it was also used to preserve the meat and the fish so they didn't spoil. In the first century, salt was extremely important and extremely valuable. Some even think that in some regions it was as valuable as gold. So as soon as Jesus started talking about salt, it's likely that everyone around him would have suddenly started paying closer attention to what he was saying, because they knew they could relate to what he was talking about. Let's continue with verse 14. You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand that gives light to everyone in the house. Okay, so now Jesus is talking about light. Again, not a trick question, but what is light used for?
Energy.
Energy,
Electricity.
To guide your path.
to guide your path,
To see.
to see, right? Again, this one is a little bit straightforward. We use light to help us see in the dark. Up until this point, Jesus hasn't said anything that the crowd doesn't already know. Thankfully, he doesn't stop there. Check out verse 16. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. Did you see what he did right here? 1 minute, he's talking about salt and light. And the next, suddenly he is talking about you and me. We realize he's not talking about salt and light at all. He's talking about us. We were made by God to do good things so that when people see those good things, they shouldn't just see us. They should see the God that made us. But honestly, I feel like we are still left with a number of questions. Like, what about the salt? What about the light? And what do those things actually have to do with us? One of the best ways to answer those questions is to imagine yourself in the shoes of someone who was there. What if we are living near the Sea of Galilee in the first century, listening to Jesus as he taught? There are at least, what I would think, two things that would jump out at us right away. And the first is this: there's no such thing as salt that has lost its flavor. Jesus asked the question, what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? And then he asked, well, can you make it salty again?
No.
These questions have puzzled me a bit over the years because I've always had trouble imagining this scenario that Jesus is describing. How exactly does one make salt lose its flavor in the first place? And the answer is, you can't. Both questions are 100% most definitely trick questions. Salt that has lost its flavor would be useless even if it were possible, but it's not. And since salt can't lose its flavor, it's equally impossible to make salt salty again. Jesus knows this, and so do the people who are listening. They would have heard this and immediately thought, what absurd questions. Why would Jesus be talking about this? And they would have been right. But what about the lamp? Well, that leads to the second thing that would have jumped out to the people listening. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. So for this one to make sense to us, there are a few things that we need to realize about what it was like to live in the first century. First, we got to remember there's no electricity. This is hard for us. It seems obvious, but it's kind of hard for us because we literally live with electricity 24/7 a day, so it's pretty easy to forget. Second, since there was no electricity, the lamps they used burned fuel. And it's thought that the most common fuel that they used would have been olive oil, since Jerusalem was was known for growing olives. And third, their baskets or bushels would have been made out of wood. More specifically, they would have been woven from very thin pieces of wood or dried fibers from a palm tree. Fourth, and this is the big one, their baskets would have been extremely flammable. If you put a burning lamp full of olive oil under a basket, you know what you're going to get?
Fireball.
You're going to get a basket that's on fire. And you can't put out an oil fire with water. That will only make things worse. The only way to put it out would be to smother it with a blanket, which would ruin the oil, the basket, and the blanket. So again, Jesus knows this, and so do the people who are listening. They would have heard Jesus say, no one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket, and their first thought would have been, another absurd idea. And again, they would have been right. So now Jesus has asked two absurd questions and made one absurd statement. And I would imagine that if I were in the crowd, I would have said, what more absurd thing is Jesus going to say next? And then he says this in Matthew 5:16. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. I think Jesus wanted the crowd and us tonight to realize that we are all valuable and made for a specific purpose. Salt is valuable and made to make food taste better. We can't eat French fries without salt. It can't stop being salt. If you try to make it something that it's not, you just can't. Oil is valuable. When properly used, it is useful for helping people see at night. However, when you try to make it something that it's not, it can be incredibly dangerous. You are valuable and made for good deeds. If it's absurd trying to change salt or olive oil in a way that it's not meant to be, then why would we think that we are any different? Jesus is saying that it is just as absurd to see ourselves as anything other than incredibly valuable and made for a purpose. So what is that purpose? To do good deeds so that others will see the goodness of the God who made us. So now I figure you're thinking, what in the world does this have to do with Transformers? The thing that made Transformers and Decepticons so incredible in the 80s was that at first they looked like one thing. Again, some type of car, a boat, a plane. But when you took a closer look, you realized they were something completely different. They were robots in disguise. And as revolutionary as an idea for a kid's toy as it was, appearing one way but really being something completely different is a terrible way for us to go through life. It's not only damaging to our relationships and your reputation, but it's also incredibly different to maintain two different versions of yourself. It's not good for you, it's not good for us, it is exhausting. Plus, as Christ followers, it's really difficult for us to allow our good deeds to shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise our Heavenly Father if we are not the same people in here as we are out there. So that begs the question tonight. What can we do to help ourselves be the same person in here and out there? Be the same person God created us to be, no matter where we are. I have a few ideas tonight that I think can help. And the first is this. Choose who you want to be. You have two choices. Pick one. One of the interesting things about Transformers is that it's actually kind of difficult to answer the question, are they robots or are they cars? I know most of us in this room have grown up in church. We've been in church our entire lives, sometimes even in the womb. And it's not a bad thing. But have any of you ever been asked by your friends after you've done something or said something and they said, hey, wait, Aren't you one of those church kids? If you have, that's exactly what I'm talking about tonight. Are you the same person in here as you are out there? Here's what I would suggest. At some point this week, set aside some time to actually think about and write down an answer to the question, who do I want to be? And the reason I'm suggesting writing it down is because writing tends to slow us down, make us think, make us focus. And there's something about writing it down that makes it feel, I don't know, maybe real or more official. Plus, if you write it down, if you do a journal or keep your notes, you'll always have something that you can go back and reread as a way to encourage yourself during times when it's difficult to be consistently the same person in here as you are out there. But choosing who you want to be is only the first step. Another thing that you can do is to be on the lookout for times when you might be tempted to be someone else. You need to be on the lookout. Because there will be times when you're like, oh wait, maybe I can be this other person. Maybe you've noticed that there are specific places you might go or specific people that you hang around that make it more likely that you feel the need to be a different you. If so, I really want to encourage you to pay attention to those triggers so that you can start to prepare yourself to remain consistent no matter where you are or who you hang out with. And here's an idea I realized the other day. Did you know that the Reminders app on your phone has a location setting so it can remind you of things based on where you are? So if you realize that you tend to become a different person when you go to football games on Friday nights, you might try setting a reminder that goes off whenever you arrive at the football field. Or if you know that the toughest time that you have is right after you get off the bus in the morning and you have to be at school, maybe you find it easy to set a reminder 10 minutes before you get off the bus that says, hey, take a breath. Or maybe you just set up a few reminders this week that will pop up and say, be salt and be light. So that you can remember what Jesus said about how valuable we are and the purpose that we have. One last thing. If you find yourself in a situation and you realize that you're not being the person you want to be, you can always apologize and move forward. Getting caught between being two different people is awkward and embarrassing to say the least. But one of the best ways that we can show that we are trying to be the people that God created us to be is to admit when we're wrong and then do something about it. An apology is just an apology if there is no changed action. It means you didn't mean it. And it doesn't mean it's easy. I'll say this again too, that you need someone in your life that can call you out when you are doing something wrong. Or that can just tell you how it is. And in that moment when you are called out, you might say, you know what, you're right. I need to stop. I need to refocus. I need to be better. I missed the mark this time. Thank you for telling me this. I really appreciate you doing this. Because admitting you're wrong is never easy. But it's important because it gives a way for you to keep moving forward. And moving forward is what a relationship with Jesus is all about. Here's how the Apostle Paul describes it in his letter to the Ephesians church. Ephesians 5:8. For once you were full of darkness, but now you have light from the Lord. So live as people of light. He's saying that to us today. You once were full of darkness. Before you were saved, you were full of darkness, but now you have light from the Lord. So what do? We live as people of light. So by admitting you're wrong and choosing to leave the darkness behind, you're actually showing others that it is possible. Again, let's live as people of light. Let's be the same people in here as we are out there.